Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Western Tales Memories. Today, I want to share a story about a man who lived so high above the world, even the wind had to climb to find him. A story of silence, endurance, and the letter that changed the last chapter of his life. By the time the first frost crept down from the bitter roots, Thomas Keene had lived alone for 20 winters, long enough to forget how his own voice sounded indoors. He was 63. A stonemason by trade, a widower by fate. And up there, in a cabin built stone by stone with his own hands, he lived like the mountain itself still, patient, and scarred by weather. Below him, the valley was moving on. You could hear trains in the far distance now, church bells on Sundays, laughter spilling from new taverns and bright windows. But on the ridge where Thomas lived, the world still whispered in an older language the crack of frozen branches, the hush of falling snow, the sigh of a roof that had seen too many storms. Each morning began the same way. He lit his lamp before dawn, split his wood with a slow, steady rhythm, and laid his traps along the creek that cut through the pines. At night, he read from a Bible his wife once carried, its cover worn soft as old leather, its pages thin as breath. He spoke to her sometimes, softly, not in grief anymore, but in habit. There was no one else to answer. They used to call him the quiet mason down in the valley. Some said he'd gone strange with solitude. Others said he'd simply made peace with it. But Thomas never cared what they thought. Up here, he could feel the seasons like pulse and prayer, the slow beat of nature's patience. He didn't crave company or think much about the years behind him. He just lived one sunrise, one winter, one silence at a time. Then, one October morning, the freight driver from town came rattling up his trail, cursing the cold. He carried a sack of nails, a tin of coffee, and a single letter, sealed with violet wax. Thomas wasn't expecting mail, hadn't seen a letter with his name on it in over a decade. He turned it over once, twice. Before breaking the seal, the handwriting was graceful, careful. From another world entirely. Clara Wynne. Saint Louis. He read the name aloud like testing the sound of a prayer he'd forgotten. The words inside were simple. I don't seek comfort, only a roof and a rhythm to live by. If you'll have me, I'll bring seeds and silence in equal measure. Thomas read it again, and again until the fire burned low and the shadows climbed his walls. He told himself it didn't matter. But that night, for the first time in 20 winters, he swept the floor, patched the roof, and set an extra log by the fire outside. The frost thickened along the pines. Inside, something long frozen quietly began to thaw. Thomas Keene kept the letter on his table for 3 nights before he dared to answer it, though, truth be told, he never truly meant to write back. He only meant to understand it. Each evening, after supper and a single cup of bitter coffee, he'd light the old kerosene lamp and read the letter again slow, careful, like tracing a map of something half remembered. The ink was steady, the hand precise. Not the hand of a young woman, but of one who'd seen enough of life to write only what mattered. Her name was Clara Wynne, 58. A widow twice over. A former schoolteacher from St. Louis. Her words were plain, but there was a rhythm to them, the kind of rhythm only honesty carries. I don't seek comfort, only a roof and a rhythm to live by. If you'll have me, I'll bring seeds and silence in equal measure. Thomas mouthed the words like a man learning another tongue. Seeds and silence. It sounded less like a promise and more like an understanding. He'd seen letters before, years ago, when neighbors down in the valley sent for wives by post. Those letters were always full of bright talk. I'm fond of music. I enjoy laughter. I wish to start again. But this one carried no perfume, no soft promises, just the smell of ink and time, and the quiet dignity of someone who didn't need saving. On the second night, he read it again, slower. He noticed the way she'd crossed her T's firmly, like a teacher might, the way she'd left a tiny smudge near her signature, as if her hand had trembled not from fear, but from something else. Maybe hope. Maybe the same kind of lonely courage that had kept him alive all these years. He folded the letter carefully, smoothing the crease with his thumb. He told himself it didn't matter, she'd likely change her mind before winter set in. People from the cities always did. Still, when the lamp sputtered out and darkness took the corners of the room, he found himself murmuring her name, Clara Wynne. It filled the silence like a hymn might fill a chapel. The next morning, he swept the hearth, though it didn't need sweeping. He patched a hole in the roof that hadn't leaked in months. He even split another stack of wood, a week's worth, more than he'd ever need, all the while muttering that it was for the coming cold. Not for any letter, not for any woman. By the third night, he caught himself brushing dust off the second chair by the stove, the one that hadn't been used since his wife's passing 20 years before. He sat across from it, eyes unfocused, hands folded like a man in church. It felt foolish. It also felt right. Outside, the wind began to shift. It came from the north, now sharper, cleaner, carrying that first scent of snow. Up along the ridge, ravens lifted from the pines and drifted down toward the valley, their black wings carving through the pale sky. Animals sense change before men do. And even Thomas could feel something turning, something subtle but certain. That night, he placed the letter beside his wife's Bible and left the lamp burning low. The fire had burned down to a deep orange bed of coals, glowing like the inside of a beating heart. He lay awake for hours, listening to the wind circle the cabin, not angry this time, not cold, just restless. It moved through the eaves like a question too soft to answer. And when he finally drifted into sleep, Thomas Keene dreamed not of the years behind him, but of a wagon wheel cutting through snow, heading up the long mountain road, somewhere far away. A woman with a shawl around her shoulders was packing her herbs and her faith into a single trunk. The wind that left his ridge that night was not the same wind that arrived. It carried a whisper, faint but steady, as if the mountain itself had heard a name it meant to remember. By the time the first real snow of the season fell, Thomas Keene had almost convinced himself that the letter had been a mistake, a good thought from a lonely mind. But fate, it seems, never sends letters without intent. It happened on a morning quiet enough to hear the world thinking. The air hung pale and still, the kind that smells of iron and pine. Thomas was outside, mending the hinge on his gate, when he heard it, the faintest jingle of metal far down the ridge, a rhythm out of place in the silence. He straightened, listening. Then it came again, sleigh bells. At first, he thought it must be Pete Morrison, the freight driver from town, bringing winter goods before the roads closed. But as the sound grew nearer, he saw more than a wagon. Through the silver breath of morning, two figures emerged, a man holding the reins, and beside him, a woman wrapped in a wool shawl, the color of wet earth. The sleigh stopped in front of the cabin. Snow drifted around them in soft, swirling veils. Thomas stood at the porch, hat in hand, his breath rising like smoke. The freight driver tipped his cap, his voice puffing white in the air. "Got your mail order, Mr. Keene," said. "She's here to stay." Then, with a grin, he snapped the reins and the horses trotted off, bells fading into the trees. And just like that, they were alone. The woman stepped down, her boots sinking into the snow with a soft crunch. She was not frail as he had imagined, nor shy. There was a steadiness to her, the kind forged by long roads and harder years. Her hair, streaked with silver, was braided tight against the wind. Her face carried both lines of sorrow and light, as if the two had learned to live side by side. She looked up at him, her eyes clear, unwavering. "Is this your place?" she asked. Thomas hesitated, voice rough from disuse. "It's what's left of it." The corner of her mouth lifted. "Then we'll start there." Simple words, but they landed heavy, like the first stone in a new foundation. For a long moment, neither spoke. They only stood in the hush between breaths, the mountain holding its own silence around them. The fire inside the cabin flickered faintly through the frosted window. A raven called once from the tree line, then was gone. Thomas cleared his throat, awkwardly gesturing toward the door. He didn't say welcome. He simply stepped aside, and she nodded as if she already knew where everything was. When she crossed the threshold, the cabin changed. He couldn't explain how, but the air seemed to draw closer, warmer. The scent of pine and smoke mixed with something faint, dried herbs, maybe, or the ghost of a city perfume long since faded. She set her single trunk near the wall, removed her shawl, and looked around the small room with a craftsman's eye. "Honest," she said softly. "I can work with honest." He didn't answer, didn't need to. Something in the way she said it, calm, without judgment, steadied him more than he expected. Outside, snow kept falling, erasing the tracks of the departing sleigh until only the two of them remained, two strangers in a world reduced to white. He poured coffee in silence, the tin cups clinking faintly against the stove. She took hers without a word, her hands firm around the warmth. The only sound was the slow crackle of the fire and the faint sigh of wind pressing against the cabin walls. That evening, Thomas caught himself listening not to the storm outside, but to the small, deliberate rhythm of another person breathing under the same roof. And in that quiet, something long dormant began to stir, not excitement, not fear, but recognition, a knowing as old as the mountains themselves that every man, no matter how far he's gone into the wilderness, still waits for one voice that sounds like home. By the end of her first week on the mountain, the cabin had found a new rhythm, one not of words, but of motion and sound. The soft scrape of a chair, the clink of tin cups, the steady sigh of the wind in the stovepipe. Life, as it turned out, could be rebuilt quietly. Thomas Keene still rose before dawn, same as always. But now, when he opened his eyes, he could see the faint glow of another lamp across the room. Clara was already awake, moving through the cold morning like she'd been there her whole life, boots on, sleeves rolled, humming something old and gentle, a tune that might have come from a church 1,000 miles away. He never asked what hymn it was. He just listened. There was comfort in the sound of it, the kind of comfort that doesn't come from company, but from peace. They ate simply. Coffee, black and bitter. Stew made from dried venison and wild potatoes. And always, she'd set 2 bowls on the table before he could offer help. Once, he tried to thank her. She just smiled and said, "Eat while it's hot." So he did. And that became their way. Clara worked through the days without fuss or noise. She dried herbs from the valley and hung them along the beams. Thyme, sage, and something he didn't recognize, smelling faintly of lemon and dust. She mended the curtains that hadn't been whole since the year his wife died, humming under her breath as she stitched. She talked to the fire like it was a living thing, steady, kind, responsive. Thomas caught himself watching her more often than he meant to, not with longing, but with a quiet awe, like a man studying weather he didn't understand but trusted to be right. He'd never met anyone who could move through silence so naturally. Most people tried to fill it with talk, with laughter, with worry. But Clara seemed to carry her own weather inside her. When she was near, the quiet didn't press on him anymore. It breathed with him. Days slipped into a rhythm neither of them spoke about. He'd chop the wood. She'd stack it. He'd carry water from the creek. She'd strain it through cloth and set it near the fire to warm. She never asked about his past. And he never asked why she came. The mountain, he figured, had already asked enough of both of them. Some evenings, when the snow came hard against the walls, she'd sit by the window, hands folded in her lap, and stare into the white blur beyond the glass. He'd sit across the room, reading by lamplight, pretending not to notice the way her reflection moved in the pane faint and flickering beside his own. Once, while refilling the fire, he said quietly, "You're not afraid of the cold." She looked up from her sewing, smiled faintly. "I've lived through worse chills," she said. Then she went back to her work, and he went back to watching the fire. That night, as he lay in bed listening to the roof creak under snow, Thomas realized he hadn't spoken more than a dozen words all day. And somehow, it hadn't felt lonely. There was something in the air between them, not heat, not comfort, not yet love, but a warmth that asked for nothing and gave everything. The kind of warmth that stays long after the fire burns low. Outside, the mountain exhaled in slow, frozen breaths. Inside, 2 people who had lost nearly everything found the rarest thing of all, peace that didn't need explaining. And in that peace, in that unspoken rhythm, the winter began to change its shape. It didn't end, but it no longer felt endless. The mountain had a way of testing those who dared to stay. It waited, quiet as a prayer, then struck like judgment when the time was right. And that winter, its judgment came in the shape of a storm. It began as a restless wind, crawling down from the peaks at dusk. By nightfall, it had found its voice, a deep, hungry howl that clawed through the pines and wrapped around the cabin like a warning. Thomas had seen storms before, but not one like this. This one had weight in its breath. A cold so sharp it felt like truth itself. The snow came sideways, a white wall devouring everything it touched. The windows rattled, the door moaned against its hinges. Inside, the fire guttered, trying to hold its ground. Clara looked up from the hearth, her eyes steady. "This will be a hard one," she said. Thomas only nodded. Words were useless now. They worked side by side, no panic, no fear, just motion. He tightened the ropes along the beams overhead while she packed flour sacks against the doorframe to keep the drift out. The air filled with the smell of pine smoke and sweat. Every gust shook the cabin like the hand of an angry god. When the first beam cracked, it sounded like a rifle shot. Thomas turned, heart hammering, to see the log above the stove bowing under the weight of snow. He didn't think, just moved, shoulder against the timber, muscles straining. He pushed back with everything the years had left him. The wood screamed again, but held, trembling. Clara was already there beside him, rope in hand, her shawl half torn from the wind. Without a word, she looped the line over the beam, tightening it across his back. Her hands worked fast, sure, as if she'd been tying down storms all her life. When it was done, she pressed a handful of snow against his palms. Where the rope had burned deep, he hissed at the sting. But she didn't move her hand. The mountain takes its measure of everyone, sooner or later, she whispered. Her voice was calm, not defiant. Not afraid, just certain. And in that certainty, something inside him steadied. Hours passed without sense of time. The storm had swallowed the world. They shoveled snow from the roof between gusts, bracing against the cold that cut through bone. Wind screamed through the seams. The lanterns flickered. And still they worked, not for survival, exactly, but for the stubborn grace of not surrendering. At some point, the fury began to fade. The howling thinned, turning to a low moan, then a whisper, and then silence. The kind of silence that makes you aware of your heartbeat. When Thomas finally lowered himself by the fire, his arms shook. He could feel the ache in every part of himself that had ever been alive. Clara sat beside him, her hair undone, her hands red from rope and cold. Neither spoke. They just breathed slow, visible breaths rising into the dim air. He looked over and saw the faintest smile on her lips, the kind a person wears when they've looked death in the eye and found it polite enough to wait another day. Something in his chest cracked open then, not like pain, but like release. And before he knew it, a sound broke from him, rough, uneven, startled. A laugh. Real, deep, human. He caught himself halfway through it, almost ashamed. But Clara turned toward him, eyebrows lifting in surprise. I haven't heard that sound in 20 years, she said softly. He chuckled again. Quieter now. Didn't know it still worked. He said, voice rasping. They shared a look across the flickering firelight, not romantic, not spoken, but something deeper, a kind of recognition that went past words. Two souls who had lived long enough to know what endurance costs and what it gives back. Outside, the mountain settled under the weight of its own making. The snow stopped falling. The world, for a moment, held still. Inside, the fire found its strength again, curling upward in soft orange tongues. Clara leaned back against the wall, pulling the blanket higher across their shoulders. Thomas closed his eyes, the exhaustion sinking into him like warmth. For the first time in decades, he didn't listen for danger. He listened for her breathing beside him. And as the night stretched on, the old cabin stood scarred, but unbroken. It had passed the test. So had they. When dawn came, thin and silver through the frost, the mountain was quiet again. But something in it had changed, and deep down, Thomas knew the mountain might take its measure. But it also remembers those who hold their ground. Winter held its breath after the storm. But peace in the mountains never lasts long. The snow melted, then froze again, and each thaw left its mark. For Thomas Keene, It began with a cough, small, harmless, the sort every man ignored when the air was thin and sharp. But by the second week, the cough had weight to it. By the third, it had turned to fever. Clara noticed first. Though she said nothing, she simply began to move quieter around the cabin, setting fresh water by his bedside, pressing a hand to his forehead when he dozed. He brushed her off at first, saying it was nothing. But when his hands began to shake too hard to split kindling, she took the axe from him without a word and finished the job herself. That night, the fever came like a storm reborn. It tore through him, sweat, shivering, the world tilting in and out of focus. He dreamed of snowfields swallowing his cabin whole, of the mountain bending low to whisper his name. Sometimes he heard his wife's voice calling from far away, but it was Clara's hand he felt, cool, steady, and real. She brewed willow bark tea, the way her grandmother once had on the plains of Missouri. She dabbed his temples with cold cloths, her touch firm enough to keep him anchored in the world. And when the fever broke into delirium, she spoke to him softly, half scripture, half memory, verses from Psalms, lines from a hymn, bits of quiet wisdom she'd carried through 2 widowed lives and a lifetime of loss. "You're not done building yet, Thomas," she murmured more than once, as if the words themselves were medicine. And maybe they were, because each time she said them, he fought a little harder to wake. The days blurred together, light and dark trading places like tides. Outside, the snow softened and hardened again. Icicles grew long as daggers along the roof. Inside, the fire never died. Clara made sure of that. She barely slept. When exhaustion came, she'd nod off in the chair beside his bed, still holding his wrist, as if she could feel the fever loosening its grip through her fingertips. Sometimes, in his drifting half-dreams, he thought she was praying. Other times, he thought she was singing. He couldn't tell which. But both made the same sound, faith, whispered into the dark. Then, one morning, he woke to the light of dawn spilling across the floorboards. The fever had broken. His body felt hollowed out, weak, but his head was clear. And beside the fire, slumped in the chair, Clara slept still in her shawl, her hand fallen from his, but close enough that he could feel its warmth. He didn't speak, didn't dare. He only watched the way the light touched her face, the lines, the calm, the quiet strength carved there by time. Outside, the wind had gentled. The mountain had gone still again, as if waiting. He thought of all she had done, how she had stood through the blizzard, patched the roof, held the ropes, then stayed awake through his sickness. And something rose in him that had no name. Not the noisy kind of gratitude, not the spoken kind either. Something larger, deeper, as vast and quiet as the land around them. He didn't need to say thank you. The mountain already had, in its own way, by letting them both live another day. Clara stirred, her eyes fluttering open. He smiled faintly, voice rough as gravel. "You kept the fire." She gave a tired smile back. "I told you," she whispered. "You're not done building yet." And in that small exchange, something unshakable settled between them, a bond that had been tested, measured, and found worthy. Outside, dawn climbed over the bitter roots. Inside, 2 lives that had nearly ended found themselves beginning again. When spring came to the Bitterroots, it did not arrive gently. It came roaring through the valley like a wild hymn meltwater rushing over stone. Snow collapsing from the ridges, earth waking beneath its own weight. The air smelled of mud and pine sap, of something stubborn coming back to life. Thomas Keene moved slower these days. The fever had left him lean, but it hadn't taken his will. He rose each morning to the sound of runoff carving new paths through the creek, and the hammer of woodpeckers testing the trees for life. Beside him, Clara was already at work, tying her gray hair back with a strip of cloth and checking the roof that had carried them through the storm. There were cracks to mend and beams to replace. So, they began again side by side, not speaking much. The rhythm of their tools was its own language. Each swing of the hammer, each press of the chisel, spoke of the life that still wanted to be lived. When the final board was set and the roof no longer groaned, they turned to the lintel, the thick beam above the door that had held the weight of so many winters. It had survived the storm, but just barely. Thomas fetched his tools, and together they carved something new. Clara steadied the chisel, her hands firm but careful. She cut into the wood with the slow patience of a woman who understood time and its toll. When she stepped back, the words stood dark against the fresh grain. We endure. Therefore, we belong. Thomas ran a rough finger over the carving, tracing each letter as if reading scripture. He didn't say much, but in his silence, there was reverence for her, for the mountain, for all the things they'd survived together. That evening, they sat on the porch, mugs of coffee warming their hands. The world below them was changing, the river swelling, the meadows greening. Birdsong threaded through the air like small miracles. The cabin, newly mended, breathed with the wind instead of against it. For a long while, they said nothing. They didn't need to. The silence between them had changed. It wasn't the echo of loneliness anymore. It was a space that held understanding, gratitude, and something deeper that neither dared name. Thomas glanced at her then, his face catching the last gold light of sunset, and with the quiet conviction of a man who'd run out of time for pretense, he said, "If there's heaven, I reckon it smells like pine and bread, and you near the fire." Clara didn't answer. She only smiled, that small, knowing kind of smile that carries an entire lifetime inside it. It was enough. The evening light faded to blue. The wind gentled down the slope, and the mountain exhaled one long, peaceful breath. And for the first time since either of them could remember, the world felt whole. Summer came at last, soft and full. The valley below burst into bloom, lupine, sage, and wild flax painting the earth in quiet praise. The air was sweet with thawed soil and the sound of the river carrying winter away. One morning, a preacher from town rode up the ridge to deliver supplies, flour, salt, and letters from a world that now felt very far below. He found Thomas and Clara working side by side in the garden. Sleeves rolled, laughter tucked between them like sunlight through trees. There was no talk of ceremony, no ribbons, no crowd, just a preacher, a mountain, and two people who had already made their vows through labor and storm. They stood together on the ridge, faces lined with years, hands steady with purpose. Instead of rings, they tied thin leather cords around each other's wrists, soft, simple, enduring. When the wind rose through the aspens, Clara looked toward the peaks and said quietly, "Let it remember our names," and it did. The wind carried their promise across the valley, over rivers, through timber, into the hush of every hollow. Because some loves arrive loud and blazing, others come quiet like the first thaw. or a prayer whispered through snow. The mountain keeps both, but remembers the quiet ones longer. Soft pause. Now, my friends, before you go, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? What part of this story stayed with you most? If this tale touched your heart, leave a like. Share it with someone who still believes in love that endures. And don't forget to subscribe to Western Tales Memories, where every day we keep the spirit of the Old West alive, one quiet story at a time.